As a mainstay of DC Comics' supernatural stories, the character of Swamp Thing has always existed on the fringes of a superhero universe, embodying the past glory days of horror tales found in EC Comics as much as the mainstream adventures of cape-wearing do-gooders. Alec Holland, brilliant scientist working on a bio-restorative formula that could rejuvenate plant life anywhere on the planet, was the victim of sabotage. Engulfed in the explosion of a bomb, covered in his formula, and blown into a nearby swamp, Alec was turned into the Swamp Thing, a humanoid plant creature forever cut off from the normal human life he once lived. It's a classic tale of body horror that echoed many of the most popular scary stories seen on both page and screen at the time of the character's debut in 1971. But even with a host of well-respected authors and artists, Swamp Thing was always more of an oddity in comics than a tentpole character. Created by Bernie Wrightson and Len Wein, Swamp Thing grappled with all manner of horrifying encounters, portraying a heroic monster locked in combat with far worse creatures threatening humanity while tormented by his own nature after being turned into a so-called muck-encrusted mockery of a man. This was a dynamic that was fundamentally altered with the arrival of writer Alan Moore on the Saga of the Swamp Thing, issue number 20, in January of 1984. Moore, who would go on to create such critically acclaimed work as Watchmen, V for Vendetta, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, and much more, was still early in his mainstream comic career, but was already deeply entrenched in the themes of character deconstruction and the redefinition of the self, which would inform a great many of his most iconic works. When applied to the numerous possibilities present in a character like Swamp Thing, Moore took a simple horror character and imbued it with a bevy of existential questions. This was to be a story that centered on the very nature of what it means to be human. And when everything we believe about ourselves is suddenly proven to be a lie, what are we left with beyond the complete breakdown of our core personhood? Moore's first issue on the title, appropriately named Loose Ends, helped to close out the final story threads left by previous writer Martin Pasco, including eliminating numerous supporting characters and putting into motion the central ideas that would define his take on the character. While this issue saw Swamp Thing ponder his existence in the wake of the death of his longtime arch-villain Anton Arcane, it also, most crucially and shockingly, ended with Holland riddled full of bullets by an elite military group, killing the character in a sudden barrage of violence. This would set up the author's complete existential redefinition of the character in the following issue, entitled The Anatomy Lesson. His cold green body lying lifeless on a slab, the end is only the beginning for Swamp Thing, but it's a beginning he would never want. With the hero seemingly dead at the issue's start, Moore works to further bewilder the reader by picking up in media res and guided by the narration of an unseen character discussing the violent demise of an unknown person. Commenting on blood, death, and revenge, we are unaware of our circumstances as well as the fate of the Swamp Thing, but this horrifying opening helps set the stage for the discoveries to come. We quickly discover that our narrator is Jason Woodrue, aka the Floronic Man, a minor villain whose body is a humanoid amalgamation of plant matter and whose cracked scientific mind is employed by Avery Sunderland, a general and businessman who wishes to understand the unique biology of Swamp Thing and exploit it through his corporation. Frozen and slowly dissected by Woodrue, we discover the inner workings of Swamp Thing and are just as confounded by their inexplicable nature as the man conducting the experiment. It's given dark, horror-inflected life by artists Stephen Bissett and John Tuttleben, whose admittedly rough and sketchy work on the book may lack polish, but also help convey the off-putting and twisted nature of the story at hand. Like Woodrue himself, Moore is slowly deconstructing Swamp Thing, the writer on a metaphorical level, and the villain on a physical one. Here, Moore chooses to highlight the scientifically baseless nature of the very premise of the comic book itself as impetus for his reinterpretation of Swamp Thing. These contradictions and fallacies are slowly highlighted by Woodrue during his procedure over the course of numerous confounding weeks. How could a bioformula meant for plants change the incompatible biology of a man? How could vegetable-based organs process air and digest food like a human? What good would a brain do if solely constructed of plant matter? The transformation of human Alec Holland into the living vegetation of the Swamp Thing makes no sense once scrutinized under a scientific lens. But as comic readers, we are taught to suspend disbelief. In the anatomy lesson, Moore uses that suspension to his advantage as a storyteller. And, to the shock and glee of Woodrue, these contradictions lead to a massive revelation regarding the very essence of our lead character. The night that Alec Holland was blown up in his lab was the night Alec Holland truly died. The bio-restorative formula and the vegetation within the surrounding lab covered and consumed the scientist's corpse, slowly absorbing his memories and personality to the point where they felt compelled to form themselves into a man. Alec Holland has long been dead, and Swamp Thing was only a creature that believed itself to be a man, long pining for a life that it never truly had and could never really regain. To Woodrue's fascination, Swamp Thing was a plant that thought it was Alec Holland, a plant that was trying its level best to be Alec Holland. The memories of Holland's life were merely an impression, a dream, a hope for something better, a lie it told to itself. In fundamentally changing the nature of Alec Holland as the Swamp Thing, Alan Moore shifts the core of the character from body horror to existential horror. The difference between these two types of terror is that body horror primarily concerns the gruesome idea of a person's body rebelling and distorting around them. The mind and soul are untouched, but the flesh encasing it becomes alien and grotesque. This expresses a deep fear of the physical world, one where we are alienated from and completely, horrifyingly aware of the decaying bodies in which we live. Prior to Moore's time on the character, Holland was a man subjected to the twisting and perversion of his body, attempting to cling to his very essence of a man while trapped in a grotesque and inhuman form. Conversely, existential horror dwells upon the mind and soul, questioning the very nature of man and what it means to exist within an unfathomable and indefinable universe. Within the philosophical theory of existentialism, a person must define him or herself to create meaning for their own life, or risk being completely lost in a meaningless and empty world. Rather than an awareness of the physical world, existential horror is fueled by an awareness of the metaphysical. What is a conscious mind? What determines our own personhood? How can we perceive time and the concept of eternity? If there is a world that exists beyond our seeing eye, how do we live within it? Without the true constraints of human biology, Swamp Thing is unfrozen by Woodrue as a form of revenge upon the abusive and vile Sunderland, with the monster sprouting from his own chest and leaving the dead husk behind, happening upon the file concerning his real nature, left to be found by the Floronic Man to ensure his vengeance. The Swamp Thing is driven into complete existential madness in mere moments. In his rage, the creature smothers Sunderland to death, finding some small degree of vengeance against the man who sparked his complete loss of identity. At the core of existentialism is the proposition that existence precedes essence, with the founding principle defined in Jean-Paul Sartre's 1945 lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism. This central idea means that one's personality is not built on a previously designed model, but rather that a person chooses to engage in the creation and sustaining of a personality and the ways in which he or she lives life. There is no predetermined essence found in a human, meaning that whether consciously or subconsciously, we determine who we are. In Swamp Thing's moment of discovery, it realized that it had been living out an inauthentic experience, the ultimate expression of the concept of bad faith, by lying to itself concerning its very own nature. This is compounded by the fact that by realizing that the past was a lie due to Swamp Thing only possessing Holland's memories and not actually living through them, the hero is completely lost to the concept of facticity. Facticity is the belief that a person's past is the core of what he or she is, combined with their present and their beliefs about the future. The past helps people to define themselves and gives concrete basis for values. To completely deny the past would create an inauthentic lifestyle. However, the supernatural nature of Swamp Thing means that the past must be denied, as it was always a lie. As a result, the conscious plant that thought it was Alec Holland now finds itself wholly without basis for what it can believe and value. With the ground metaphorically pulled out from under him, Swamp Thing undergoes a mind-boggling existential crisis that is reflected in his body losing all form and reverting to an unthinking vegetable, while his mind undergoes a metaphysical journey. The creature that once believed it was Alec Holland slowly has its memories stripped away, desperately clinging to the last remaining vestiges of its humanity. As Swamp Thing undergoes the horrifying ordeal, Woodrue seizes the moment to declare himself as the avatar of the green, the embodiment of all plant life on the planet. Completely psychotic, Woodrue wishes to wipe out all mammalian life, first through small-scale violence and then through creating an excess amount of oxygen worldwide to wipe out mankind. But adrift in peaceful oblivion, Swamp Thing realizes that while he may not be human, he is also not fully plant. Caught between worlds, he is forced to redefine himself and reforge meaning for his life when Abigail Arcane, one of the last human connections he has and a source of deep inner love for Swamp Thing, is in danger of being killed by Woodrue's out-of-control plants. In moments, Swamp Thing uproots himself and saves Abigail. In his newly redefined existence, Swamp Thing rejects the name of Alec Holland, knowing that he is something else that must come to terms with a new life. Swamp Thing's confrontation with his inauthentic self has allowed him to transcend the constraints he unknowingly placed upon his essence. Freed from those limits, he now possesses far greater power and understanding of the world, and with this knowledge he confronts Woodrue, illuminating the flaw in the villain's beliefs. Should Woodrue kill all mammal life on Earth, there would be nothing to create carbon dioxide, therefore eventually killing all plant life on the planet. This new revelation shakes Woodrue to the core in a reversal of the existential crisis that nearly destroyed Swamp Thing, and cuts the villain off from his connection to the green, suddenly and completely ending his threat. With Woodrue defeated and Swamp Thing at peace with the truth, the creature is able to define himself in a moment of joyous transcendence. The lie of Alec Holland is no more, and in its place stands the Swamp Thing, a being unlike anyone else, but gifted with the opportunity to determine his own existence. Peacefully walking through the swamp he calls home, Swamp Thing reconfirms his beliefs and finds freedom in himself, stating, "I want to be alive, and grow, and rise up." Alan Moore would continue to define and redefine his central character through numerous stories that explored the life and love of a creature unlike any other on Earth, and what it means to be human. For Swamp Thing, the redefining of the self would bring newfound freedoms and the release of innumerable burdens he had never known. A shining example of how letting go of the lies we've told ourselves in the past can make possible a beautiful future.